Good morning. I hope you're doing well. I'm excited to see all of you again. Today we're going to start with a word, a single word that I think is very important for what we're going to talk about today. The word is compartmentalization. It's a big word. It's very common. It's something that we all do. We take our actions, our words, even our personality, and we break it up into little boxes, into little parts, and we spread it around, and we use different parts of our personality based on who the people are that we're spending time with. So we compartmentalize our actions based on who we're around. You can probably think of a time when you've acted differently based on whether or not your parents were around, your siblings, your friends. We all do it. Acting differently, speaking differently. It's not necessarily bad, but it is a reality in all of our lives. So in the text we're going to read today, which we're going to be picking up in Philippians chapter 4, we're in our final stretch of the book of Philippians. This is a book that Paul wrote to a church that he was very close to. He had some good friends, and he wanted to give them some encouragement and advice. And we're really getting into the advice part, where Paul is writing some things about here's how we should behave. Here's how we ought to be acting and living. In this text we're going to read today, there's a lot of cool stuff. But the heartbeat of this passage is found in 4 words tucked inside the verses, barely noticeable. Everything that Paul writes is directly connected to it. So I'm going to read a couple of verses out of this passage. I want to see if you can guess which 4 words I'm talking about. So this is the first half of chapter 4 in the book of Philippians. Therefore, my brothers and sisters, you whom I love and long for, my joy and my crown, stand firm in the Lord in this way, dear friends. I plead with Euodia and I plead with Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you, my true companion, help these women, since they have contended at my side for the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names are in the book of life. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. Okay, so think for a moment. What 4 words do you think make this whole passage stick together? And while I was reading it, I actually thought, well, what are some wrong answers that we might come up with? And there are some interesting bits that you might pick out. But I think that the most central phrase to this passage is found in verse 5. The Lord is near. That's a vital part to these verses. It's tucked away in the middle of what Paul is saying, but everything he says hinges on this single fact: the Lord is near. Right? God was near to the Philippians. He was near to Paul, and he's near to us. That gives us something to think about. So let's turn our first question about compartmentalization around. Do you act differently when God is around than when he isn't? Now, you might say, well, there isn't a time when God is not around. God is always around. But how does our awareness of God's presence affect the way we live our life? Do we always think that God is around, or do we tend to sort of forget about God for a little while and pretend that God is not there? Is your life so consistent to reflect that God is always near, or does your life change based on how you're feeling and whether or not you're thinking about God in the moment? It is true that God is here with us. He is always present in our lives. Those of us who are followers of Christ, His Spirit is with us at all times. His presence is in our midst. God, He can't just only see everything that we do. He knows our every thought. Okay? So sidestep a minute to the Old Testament. I'm not going to sit here and read you 2 chapters out of the book of Job, but if you have time, you really want to go and look at it. The chapter 38 and 39 from the book of Job. It comes towards the end of the book. Job has had this massive tragedy. He's lost everything in his life. He's lost his family. He's lost everything he ever had. He's lost his health. And he literally has nothing. And there are a couple of people who would call themselves his friends who have come to talk to him. And they have kind of put this idea in his head that, God could not possibly love you and let all this bad stuff happen to you. Or God must not be powerful enough or even real enough to stop these bad things from happening. And in this moment, God answers that challenge. He speaks to Job out of a storm, his voice booming out of the wind and the rain. And in chapter 38 and 39, God speaks. And there's this very long, poetic speech. It's really beautiful, in which God asks Job over 60 questions. And the gist of it is, look at all the stuff in creation. Look at how complicated and wonderful everything is. Could you do any of this? Could you make any of this? Could you control any of this? No, of course not. Right? And we learn something about God in these verses, that he's powerful. More than that, he's everywhere at all times, orchestrating all the things that we see and imagine. And knowing this about God, he surely knows our every thought. He's definitely present in our lives. So let me ask again, do you live in a way that reflects the nearness of God? Paul lays out some of the ways that the nearness of God should affect our lives. All right, we're going to go through kind of each one. I'm going to go back to the beginning of the chapter, and I want to show you some of the things that Paul and the early church would put into practice. Okay, and I want to challenge you to put one of these into practice, to start learning how to act in a certain way so as to reflect God's presence in your life. So let's get started. The first one is that because God is near, that demands a sense of community. In verse 2 and verse 3, I'm not going to go try and reading those names again, but he's talking about people in the Philippian church. And there is obviously some sort of dispute between these two women. They have an argument, and he pleads with them. He says, be of the same mind in the Lord, right? The problem is an argument. We're not told what specifically, but he's encouraging them to reach some sort of reconciliation. Sometimes we think of being part of a church as just something that, like, it's a place that we go. But more than a place to go, it's a group of people to belong to. And that's something that we shouldn't take for granted. When we talk about being a church, you got to realize it takes work. We don't always get along with other Christians, and we experience conflict. But when we do experience conflict, we should be working at resolving it. Right? If you are in the midst of an argument with a friend, or some sort of gossip or betrayal, if you have that sort of problem with a friend and you are both followers of Jesus, that needs to come to a resolution. It should stop. God is near. God is with you. Why don't we live like it? So when we talk about these sort of practices, and I'm going to use the word disciplines, which is kind of a word to mean something that we study but also do. When we talk about disciplines, we're talking about things that we do on purpose, things that we do to grow. So when you hear the word discipline, you might think of like a punishment, but it's really something very different. Discipline is a study, and it's something that is put into place for growth. So practicing a discipline, practicing something like that, it's kind of like doing your homework. or studying for a test. It might not be the most fun thing, but you don't learn as quickly without it. So the second discipline, the first one was that sense of community. The second discipline is in verse 4. It says, the nearness of God demands a sense of joy. Right? Paul says that we should have joy always. Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. He repeats himself. So if he repeats himself, it must be worth repeating. He says in an earlier chapter, and you can go back in the playlist, which there will be a link in the description, you can go back and see there are times when he repeats the things he's saying. And he comes out and says, I know you've heard some of this stuff before, and I'm going to say it again because it's good for you to hear it again. Rejoice in the Lord always. Right? Now remember, where was Paul when he wrote these words? He was in prison. He was on house arrest. And he was quarantined. He was stuck in one place, not allowed to leave, not allowed to see the people he cared about. I think it probably was pretty hard for him to have that sense of joy as he spent all this time in jail. But while he was there, he grabbed onto every opportunity. Right? He definitely had that attitude of, I'm not just locked in here with you. You're locked in here with me. So I'm going to preach about Jesus. Right? He always had that sense of joy. And it came from knowing that God was near. Number 3, the nearness of God, it demands a sense of courage, right? That we not worry. Right? Think about where and what were you most afraid of when you were a kid? Was there a place that you wouldn't go? Was there something that you just couldn't be around because you were too afraid? How did you deal with it? I think most of us, when we're children, we deal with our fears by running to parents or adults, people who will take care of that fear for us. We're less afraid when we know that someone more powerful, someone more capable is looking out for us. And we know that we're not alone. See, no matter how close God is, we still worry. Right? The disciples worried about what they were going to eat, whether they would survive the storm. They were with Jesus all the time. Worry is a hard thing to fight, but we do need to fight that. We have to fight that sense of worry and instead train ourselves to the discipline of courage. Verse 6 says, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and that peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. That's a great little formula. It's like a step-by-step thing. Like if you're worried, 1, pray, right? Prayer and petition, meaning praying to God, talk to God, but also ask God. That petition means ask God for the thing that you need. So talk to God, tell him about your worries, be thankful for God's presence, and present your requests. Give God your requests and tell him what you're worried about. He says, and you will get a peace it's a peace that is so profound that you really can't understand it. You can't describe it. And that peace is what protects you. It's a really, really beautiful picture. And number 4, this is the fourth discipline. The nearness of God demands pure thoughts. This one is probably the most difficult, right? Because we've talked about how not only does God see our actions, but he knows our thoughts. His mind is more powerful and complex than ours. We can't keep anything from God. We can't understand everything that God is and everything that God plans, but we also can't even begin to try to outsmart God, right? He knows everything about us inside and out. And that's a little bit scary to think about, but it's the truth. We can't keep anything from God. The next 2 verses, number 8 and 9, they say that the fact that God is near should change the way we think. And instead of giving us a big list of things that we shouldn't do, instead of saying, stop thinking about this, stop dwelling on these bad things, Paul instead gives us a list of helpful guidance about what we ought to be thinking about. Right? He says, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy. Right? These are words that are used to describe good things. Right? It means being Christ-centered in our thought life, the things that we choose to dwell on. Now, I'm not talking about the random thoughts that wander through your mind from time to time, but I'm talking about the things that we choose to dwell on, the thoughts that we nurture, the thoughts that we hold and form and keep in our minds. Right? Because those thoughts affect your actions. Right? Thoughts are kind of like the diving board for our actions. Right? You have to get out on the edge and make the jump. Just because you think of something doesn't mean you're going to do it. But in order to do it, you have to think it first. So what does God think of your thought life? The things that you choose to dwell on in your mind. Would God be pleased with those thoughts? Think about this. If your thoughts were always broadcast on a screen, duct taped to your forehead, how many of the same people would you hang out with? How long would your parents, how long would they have a good relationship with you? Would you be embarrassed when you go to church, when you go to school? Would you get kicked out of the classroom? We can laugh about it, but the truth is our thoughts are broadcast to God, and He knows them. The way we think is a discipline. It's something that we train our minds to think thoughts that are true and noble and all those other things. And sometimes we need this discipline more than others. So, let me go back. Right? God is near, and the fact that He is near to us demands that we have a few disciplines. That we train ourselves to a few ways of acting, a sense of community, a sense of joy, a sense of courage, and thoughts that are pure. Right? That's a lot to work on. But every single one of us can think of at least one of those 4 areas in which we need a lot of growth. So I want to challenge you to participate in one of those disciplines this week. And later on down the line, I'm going to ask you to share your experiences. We're not going to have a clipboard or a form to fill out today. I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to see and talk to most of you in the very near future. So I just want to ask you to take this challenge seriously. Pick one of those 4 things, and really work at it. Study it, practice it, so that we can experience the nearness of God more fully through action. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I've really been blessed to be going through this series with you. Next week, we're going to have our last week where we finish up the second half of this chapter. It's going to be the end of the book of Philippians, and hopefully tie a nice little bow on the whole thing and wind down. I'm definitely open to some suggestions. If you have anything you want to leave in the comments as to what we should do after this, if you've really just been wondering about something in the Bible, or if you have been interested in a different book and you'd like me to break it down for a couple of weeks, I would love to see some suggestions. Otherwise, I hope you have a great week. God bless you, and I'll see you soon.